Hello. The topic for this unit is the view known as moral pluralism, rather a set of views. Moral pluralism is as opposed to moral monism. Plural, of course, means more than one thing. Monism comes from root, which means one thing. So far, the major moral theories we've taken a look at are both examples of monist theories. That is, they are theories that says that there is only one supreme moral rule or principle. In the case of utilitarianism, that is the principle of utility, that is causing the greatest overall good. And in the case of Kantian moral theory, that is the categorical imperative, right? The singular rational procedure through which to put a maxim to gain an understanding of one's duty. All right. So in each case, they have one thing that they look at. There's one factor that determines whether something is the right thing or the wrong thing to do. And so that's what makes them monist theories. So the other thing about monist theories of morality is that they are all absolute, okay? Certainly the ones we've seen. That is that the single moral principle should never be violated. It's an absolute moral principle. It's one of those things where you'll never see a utilitarian saying, well, sometimes you don't go for the thing with the greatest consequence. That's not at all their game. You don't see Kant saying, well, sometimes you can violate the categorical imperative. It just doesn't work that way. So the single principle, because it is the moral principle, should never be violated. And of course, that moral principle is also fundamental. That is, there's no deeper or more important principle. Okay, so the idea is that the utilitarian is a utilitarian because they use the principle of utility to decide morality. If they used some other principle, they'd be something else. They wouldn't be utilitarians. So if there was some other more fundamental principle than the principle of utility for them, well, they wouldn't be utilitarians. Again, this is of necessity, right? If you're a moral monist, your single principle has to be absolute and has to be fundamental. Now, of course, we have seen that each of the moral theory we've been dealing with has problems, some somewhat more so than others. Some of the very early ones we took a look at were, had really horrible problems, enough to sort of abandon them. The later ones, utilitarianism and Kantianism, were much better, but it's not like they're problem-free. So just to run down the list, relativism and subjectivism amount to a denial of the very existence of morality, and they, in many cases, don't get off the ground themselves. Subjectivism certainly is internally inconsistent, and both of them sort of fly in the face of sort of everything we sort of really do think that morality is or should be like. The divine command theory suffers from accusations of being either arbitrary or irrelevant. Again, if you don't see that one, review the Euthyphro dilemma, and on one lemma, that divine command theory is arbitrary, and on the other lemma, it's irrelevant. Utilitarianism, of course, is flexible, it's demanding, it's impartial, right? It's all of those things. But of course, those are all good things to have in a moral theory to some extent. But also, to some extent, they also give critics of utilitarianism some handle for criticism. Utilitarianism might well be too flexible or too demanding or too impartial, or some combination of those things. And it also might be that there is more to morality than consequences. But on the other side of the coin, Kantian moral theory does consider intent. That's a very good thing. It has some very plausible moral rules. This idea that you shouldn't make exceptions for yourself, this idea that you shouldn't treat people like things. It's a good basis for universal human rights, which we think are very morally important. So these are all very good things about Kant. They're legitimately good things about Kantian moral theory. But it has some troubles. It doesn't really generate positive duties very easily. That is, it tells you what not to do, but isn't very good at telling you what to do. It also doesn't handle conflicts of duties well. Kant himself didn't think that there was such a thing. It wasn't possible to have anything conflict with the categorical imperative. He might simply have been mistaken about that. And of course, it doesn't consider consequences at all, right? Which, again, in certain cases, looks like it might be a problem for the theory. And so we're left, what to do about this, right? We have some moral theories that have some good points and some bad points. And Schäferlandau, our textbook author, suggests three options that the monist can take to sort of handle this kind of issue. First, we could look for some new fundamental principle other than those we have seen so far that perhaps would be better. right? So if you think that the problems with utilitarianism are bad enough that you maybe should look for a better moral theory, well, this is one thing you could do. You can look for something other than utility. If you don't think Kant has it, look for something also other than Kant's versions of the categorical imperative. Um, and you could again just look around for another one, or use your imagination, try and come up with something that it's better, that will have explain much of what we think is obvious about morality, get some of these hard cases right, avoid having the same kinds of problems, or worse problems certainly than the moral theories we've taken a look at. That's always an open possibility. The second thing you could do is just simply follow the best of the theories we've seen so far and just address its imperfections with some modifications. Largely, that's what we've been doing with utilitarianism and with Kantian moral theory. We've made sort of some minor modifications. We've interpreted the theories as well as we can, and that helps to mitigate some of the difficulties that these theories have and preserve what they really do seem to get right. And that's, this is, I would say, the most common approach to dealing with moral theories that we currently have. And this is going to be the proposal of some of the authors in this unit, you could simply abandon ethical monism in favor of ethical pluralism. That is, give up on the idea that there is only one fundamental principle, and say that there's more to it. I want to head off a particular kind of misunderstanding, or sort of make this warning right at the outset. And here's what it is. People very often assume that between two extreme positions, there is always an option in the middle that is better than each extreme. Okay, and I've made sure to highlight this here. This is not necessarily the case. Okay, there are many kinds of disagreements that are simply fundamental and that are binary. So, for example, the question, are consequences relevant to morality? Well, either they are or they aren't. Okay, and if only some consequences are relevant to morality, well, then some consequences are still relevant to morality. And so you don't get a middle ground. Either there is at least one consequence that is relevant to morality, or there is not. Okay, there are not middle ground options there. That's just not logically possible in this case. Right? You might say there could be some position between utilitarianism and Kantianism where you can say, yeah, consequences matter, but they're not all that matters. Okay, and the temptation would be to say that this would be better. But again, that's not necessarily true, right? We shouldn't necessarily expect that to be the case. Because what results when we compromise in that way is that we oftentimes give up what was originally valuable for no real gain. Okay, so another way to put this is that in looking for the best of both worlds, sometimes we end up with the worst of both worlds instead. Right, and so the idea is, if we want to say, well, look, consequences matter, but they're not everything. Well, now all of a sudden, utilitarianism isn't as impartial as it used to be because it doesn't consider just the consequences. It gives up on its demandingness, okay, because again, consequences aren't all that matter, and also the flexibility becomes of an entirely different character. The idea is that if you now have to decide which consequences are important and which aren't, or when they're important and when they're not, it's going to be very easy to in fact have an arbitrary view here, and that would be a big problem. It would be a giant, huge problem. You don't want an arbitrary moral theory. But then the other thing is that you don't get you also don't get the consistency of Kant's moral theory. If you have a theory like this, where one of the nice things about Kant's moral theory is that it allows for, say, for example, human rights that you just can't violate. But if you all of a sudden have if consequences sometimes matter, well, then you can sometimes violate the rights in exchange for consequence. And all of a sudden you lose what we originally liked about the theory, without necessarily gaining what we liked about utilitarianism or something like that. So again, these kinds of compromises oftentimes are worse than the end points, right? They're worse than the extreme positions. Not always, but often enough that you shouldn't always just assume that there's got to be something in the middle that's better than each extreme. That's not always true. And so let's talk now about moral absolutism in general, so that we can then talk about absolutist pluralism. I will have to say here that this is one of the chapters where I think that Schaefer-Landau has not explained things or laid things out as clearly as he might have. This doesn't, of course, mean you don't have to read it or don't have to worry about it, but certainly I think that in this case, Schaefer-Landau could have done sort of better at trying to lay things out more clearly. So I'm going to try and clarify to the greatest extent that I can what's really going on in there, because I don't necessarily think it's obvious. Nobody's perfect, right? I have very few complaints about the Schaefer-Landau text, but this is one of them. I don't think this chapter is as clear as it might be. So let's take a look at this issue as a major issue. Okay, so all monist positions, right? That is, positions that say that there is one and only one supreme moral principle. They're all absolutist because, of course, the point is you should follow the one moral principle. Okay, and that's just part of the way those theories work. So as I put it here, what would be the point of having one supreme moral principle if you were not obligated to follow it? Okay, so if you have one supreme moral principle, of course, that's the thing you have to follow. That's what makes it a kind of absolute. Okay. Some pluralist positions are absolutist, saying that there are more than one binding moral principle and that none of them should ever be violated. Okay, it says there's more than one absolute moral principle. So that's where we're getting into pluralist absolutism. And this adherence to absolutism causes several problems for both monist and pluralists. Okay? So moral absolutists have some challenges here, and we're going to go through some of those challenges using a familiar example. So let's take a look at some of the cases that are difficult for our monist theories so far, that are also absolutist theories because they're monist. So this is pretty familiar, the cases of like torture, of framing the innocent, etc. Right? So these cases pit an allegiance to consequentialism against valuing justice, human dignity, or whatever. Right? The utilitarian, for example, sort of simply has to live with this. Right? This is very much like the case that J.J.C. Smart describes, where the sheriff has to essentially kill an innocent person in order to preserve the best overall consequences. And Smart himself says, look, I'm not happy about these kinds of consequences. I certainly think it's terrible that such things should ever happen. But if they do, I would still do the right utilitarian action. I would still do that which brought about the best overall consequences, because that's just better. So the utilitarian tends to just have to live with those cases, and it's not very comfortable. But of course, on the other side of the coin, there are the dire consequences or preventing catastrophes cases. Right? These are cases just like Kant has, where somebody comes to your house and says, "Hey, is your friend in there? I'm going to kill him." Right? And are you allowed to lie in this case? And Kant just sort of has to say no. Right? We have a single absolute moral principle here, right? And you can't just say it applies sometimes and not other times, and because then it's not a single absolute moral principle. And so even when the consequences of obeying your moral duty are very, very bad, you still just have to do it. And the non-consequentialist, like Kant, for example, just simply has to live with that. Maybe it's a very uncomfortable way to live with it, but that's kind of what they do. So these are again difficult cases, but they're familiar to us by now. And so all of the simplest forms of absolutist pluralism, that is, theories that would say, well, let's just follow both utilitarian and Kantian rules, would be completely paralyzed in cases like this, right? Because the cases of torture or framing the innocent, et cetera, these cases that say that utilitarianism is too flexible, well, there's a clear utilitarian thing to do and there's a clear Kantian thing to do. The Kantian would never use this innocent person as a means for anything else. The utilitarian would always try and bring about the best overall consequences. And so an absolutist pluralist who just decided to adopt both theories would just face an impossible situation here, right? Because the theories don't always say the same thing about what morality is. Same in the dire consequences case. The follower of the Kantian theory would say, no, you have to tell the truth. And the theory of follower of consequentialism would say, no, of course not. You have to lie in this case. And of course, because those two moral theories tell you two different things, an absolutist pluralist is just in a kind of gridlock. It doesn't work. And so there are some ways that absolutists of these kinds, and really of all kinds, they propose some ways of making their responses to those difficult cases appear to violate their principles without actually violating their principles. Right? Their way out of this kind of trouble, this kind of deadlock. And so in order to try and explain what they say here, I'm going to go ahead and reuse some of these examples from very early in the course, these trolley cases, because they're really excellent cases. Okay. And so to refresh your memory, I'll go ahead and put the cases out in full, but I'm not going to really dwell on them because we have been over this once. So again, remember the trolley case, okay? And if you don't quite remember it, go ahead and pause it, read the text. But the idea is that there's a trolley, it's out of control, the brakes don't work, and the question is whether you turn the trolley, right, and then kill the one, or leave the trolley where it is, kill the five, and there's it seems like we have an easy answer. Of course, you should turn the trolley, or at least you're allowed to turn the trolley to result in the death of one person rather than the death of five. Right? It seems like there's a kind of numbers game there. And then, of course, the problem, okay, is when we start to oppose this to the doctor case, where we have this, surgeon who has a patient who's, perfectly healthy, come in just for a routine checkup, who happens to have this rare blood type and all these, these organs that five of the other patients need, or else they're going to die soon. And so it seems like the doctor has this choice: well, he can operate on this healthy patient, cut them up, or not. Okay? So now back to moral absolutism. Now, the consequentialist, remember, this is like the utilitarian here, has an easy time with the trolley case. Okay, it's just a numbers game. You pick the situation that has the best overall consequences. That means that one person should end up dead at the end of it rather than five. Those consequences are better, and pretty clearly so. So the consequentialist has a very easy time explaining what to do in that kind of a case. But they have a really hard time with the doctor case because it seems like they should have to say the same thing. They should say, well, look, after the guy cuts up his healthy patient, there are five people alive and one person dead. And if he just sort of lets this patient go about his or her life, then there are five people dead and one person alive, and that's just not the best overall consequence. So again, it seems to give us what we think is the wrong answer in the second case. But of course, the rights-based thinker, something like a Kantian, has a very easy time with the doctor cases. Of course, you don't use this one person as a means to save the five, right? But they have a really hard time with the trolley case. It's a much harder thing. And they say, well, no, you can't use this person to sort of save the other five. And that again seems like it's kind of the wrong answer. And the pluralist absolutist is paralyzed in both cases, right? So again, this is one of those cases where if you try and adopt some elements of each theory, like take up what's plausible about both of them, you end up with a position that's very much worse than either one. Whereas the utilitarian has trouble with one of these cases, but a really easy time with the other. The Kantian has an easy time with one of these cases, kind of a hard time with the other. But the pluralist absolutist just has a hard time with both. And that means pluralist absolutism has a real problem. And so these kinds of absolutists tend to want to describe their responses in such a way that allows them to get the most intuitive answer to each of these two cases, or cases like them. So they're going to try and explain away the problem. Right? They're going to say, okay, well, here's why you can still be a pluralist absolutist. And so one of the ways of explaining away the problem that has received an awful lot of philosophical ink over the many, many years since it was sort of first proposed a long time ago. It's a golden oldie. It's called the doctrine of double effect, okay, or the distinction between intending and foreseeing. Okay, and the proposal says this: that you can appear to be violating a moral rule, but not really violate the moral rule. Okay. So here's how it would apply to these kinds of cases. So the proposal is that you can turn the trolley because your intent is to turn away from the five, even though you can foresee killing the one. Okay? But you can't operate on the one without intending to kill them. That's the idea. So the idea is it gives you the right answer in the trolley case, that you can turn the trolley, and then gives you the answer in the doctor case because it said you can't operate on the patient. And they want to say that the idea is that you can. Your intent is just to turn away from the five in the first case, even though you can foresee killing the one. But it seems like you can't operate on the one without intending to kill them. So that's the sort of thing. You're allowed to. You're not allowed to intend an immoral act, but you are allowed to intend a moral act, which would be, turning away from 5 would be moral, even though you can foresee some immoral consequence or something like that. I mean, it's creative, okay, but it's not really going to work very well. So the trouble is that it's what's known as a sophistry. Okay? And again, I would very strongly encourage you to take a look at this part of the Schaeffer-Landau text. I think this is reasonably clearly put. A sophistry is something that is sort of a play on words rather than a genuine argument. Now, some people get the idea that all of philosophy, or certainly all of ethics, is just wordplay or something like that. That's not true. In general, when we're arguing in ethics, we're arguing about what the words refer to, right? We're arguing about morality. We're not arguing about the word morality. We're arguing about what kinds of things should rightly be called moral, and which things should rightly not be called moral, right? Where it's not really about the words; it's about the things that the words refer to. In this case, though, it seems like there's just a bit of clever word substitution going on that doesn't make the argument ultimately work. Okay, so here's how that goes. It seems like we could just as easily say that we intended to save the 5, even though we foresaw having to operate on the 1, right? And then the rights-based theorist would not get to fail to notice intentionally violating the rights of the 1 on the tracks, right? And so it doesn't really get us out of the idea that rights and consequences are sometimes genuinely opposed to one another in the situation that we're describing, because they just are, right? In one case, we feel like rights are more important to the doctor case, and in another case, we often feel like consequences are more important, such as the Trolley case. Now, maybe that means we're simply mistaken in one of those two cases. That's always possible, but we certainly can't just have it both ways. The doctrine of double effect doesn't really help us out of that. Another proposal for explaining away the trouble and allowing absolutist pluralism to continue, on its merry way, is this idea of a distinction between doing and allowing. Okay, and again, if you're thinking as clearly as possible here, you should be thinking to yourself, wait a second, didn't Thompson talk about killing versus letting die, and isn't that kind of the same thing? And isn't this going to just not work for the same reason? If you are thinking that, you can pat yourself on the back. You're exactly right. Okay, and you're very clever with the way that these sort of ethical arguments work. Or you've read the text and have seen that, and there you go. But the text, of course, doesn't draw exactly this parallel. So here's how it works. Somebody is going to die whatever we do, and so we're just letting fewer die rather than letting more die, okay, in the Trolley case. While in the doctor case, we have to kill someone or else we let 5 die. But since killing is presumably worse than letting die, we can turn the Trolley because it's a case of letting die versus letting more die versus letting fewer die. But we can't operate because that's killing versus letting die, right? So it's a kind of thing where it's doing versus allowing. And again, that would seem to mean you could get the right answer in both cases and maintain your view. And again, that's better than the doctrine of double effect, but Thompson, of course, does demonstrate the problem by modifying each case slightly. So she introduces, remember, the trolley bystander case, in which the trolley bystander, if they do nothing, right, they let 5 die, but if they turn the trolley, if by themselves involving themselves in the situation, pulling the lever, then they will have killed 1. Okay, and so then it's the trolley bystander versus the original doctor case, where it's the cases are again parallel. It's a case of letting 5 die versus killing 1, and so it seems like you should be able to say the same thing in both. You should have to say the same thing in both cases, but of course we want to say that the bystander really can turn the trolley, and so again we get one of our cases gets kind of a wrong answer there. And of course, if you could also modify the doctor case and compare it to the original trolley driver case. Remember, the trolley driver, if they decide to continue, are killing 5, and if they decide to turn, are killing 1. Okay. The mistaken doctor, remember, dispensed chemical X, and now all of a sudden, if these patients die, these 5, it really is his fault. He will have killed them. And so then his choice now is to kill 5 versus kill 1. And again, it looks like we get the wrong answer in the case of the mistaken doctor, because it's, the choice is, kill 5 versus kill 1. It seems like killing 1 is better than killing 5. And so again, we would have to turn the trolley, and we would have to operate. So again, this doing versus allowing business doesn't really get us out of the essential problem. And so this doing versus allowing thing, which is essentially the same distinction, doesn't really do any better. Okay. So the point of all this is that the very existence of difficult cases, cases like the Trolley cases versus Doctor cases, or cases like the sheriff case and Kant's case where someone's going to try and kill the friend who's hiding in the house, all of those cases, uh, the very existence of these difficult cases might mean that there is just more than one legitimate moral principle, and that while you shouldn't violate any of them if you can help it, you may sometimes have to violate one to further another. And if that's the kind of view that we're opting for in the face of the difficulties of the previous view, then what we're going for is a kind of non-absolute pluralism. And so the most famous exponent of non-absolute moral pluralism is a fellow by the name of W.D. Ross. I believe that's William David Ross. Was a very prominent moral philosopher of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And one of his articles is assigned reading. It's the article called "What Makes Right Acts Right." So we'll talk a little bit about Ross's view momentarily. So first thing to notice about Ross is as you read through his piece, you'll notice that he's a non-consequentialist. He expresses some non-consequentialist ideas about morality. The first thing he does is he rejects classical utilitarianism, and the reason he does that is because he rejects hedonism. Okay? So if you'll notice, the article itself starts off with this discussion of an idea of G.E. Moore's, another very important philosopher of the early 20th century, called ideal utilitarianism. So this is a version of utilitarianism that also rejects hedonism. G.E. Moore thought that there was probably more to life than pleasure. And so his idea of the best moral theory was, he says, look, whatever is ultimately good, whatever action produces the most of whatever that is the morally correct action. Now, that sounds like a cop-out, but it's not, right? What Moore's trying to do is just trying to make, at the most abstract level, a description of the best moral theory. And yes, that would leave undone the project of deciding what ultimately was, the ultimate good. But of course, that's a separate project. If you can separate sometimes things into individual projects and just accomplish one of them, you've made some kind of progress. So that was G.E. Moore's proposal. Ross doesn't agree. He doesn't think that would be the best moral theory because he thinks consequentialism, and it's a consequentialist theory, it just isn't very good. He rejects the very idea that the right-making characteristics of an action are its consequences. So just like Kant, he is a non-consequentialist. He has a sort of famous phrase. He says, when a plain man considers, what he ought to do, he doesn't think of producing the greatest overall good. He doesn't think about overall total consequences. He thinks about other things instead. Okay, and he thinks the things that people think about rightly are what the various features that would make an action right or wrong. These things that are intrinsic to the action itself. So he's a non-consequentialist. And very important to Ross's moral theory is this idea of a moral duty. Now, of course, all moral theories tell us what our duties are. Ross thinks that there's actually lots of them, right? As opposed to just one for a utilitarian, that is maximize utility, or just one for the Kantian, follow the categorical imperative, right? He thinks there's a bunch of them. And he thinks that duties are generated by features about the past and the present, really not the future, that is not consequences. Right? He thinks that the features of the past and present, situations that people find themselves in, he thinks these are what generate moral duties, not consequences. And so what is relevant to what you ought to do is not what will happen as a result of what you do. Instead, your duty is, whatever your duty is in some case, depends about facts about the past and present in that case. So let's make that a little more concrete. This is where we run into an important piece of vocabulary about Ross. Ross has this discussion of what he calls prima facie duties. Okay, so the word prima facie, it's old corrupt medieval Latin. So it was, when Latin was more exclusively a written language, not a language that people grew up speaking or anything like that by this point. And so there's really no correct pronunciation of prima facie. I say prima facie. Some people say prima facie. Some people say prima facie. Or some combination thereof. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter at all. But this is where we're going to end. This is an important point about vocabulary, so certainly make a note of this. So this is where Ross is going to depart substantially from Kant's moral theory. Kant is also a non-consequentialist. Kant agrees that consequences are not relevant. But for Kant, all duties are categorically imperative. That is, that like you just must do it. There's one moral law, and that's the categorical imperative, and you always have to follow that. But for Ross, there's more than one of those things, and these duties are what he calls prima facie duties. Right? Now, what does he mean by prima facie? Okay. Well, the phrase prima facie means very loosely. It doesn't have. I don't think it has a great literal translation. Something like at first glance, or sort of on the face of it, or something like that, right? It's an epistemological notion. That means that it has to do with how we come to understand something. Very often, this phrase is used in law, right, to say that if you're going to say charge somebody with a crime, the idea is that you should have what's known as a prima facie case against them. That is, it's one of those things where if you just look at the evidence all by itself, there at least appears to be some good reason to subject somebody to trial. That's the idea. Is that the case has at least all of its parts. Right? That you have everything that you sort of need, even if on later examination some things might be found to be faulty or whatever. A prima facie case is the case at least at first glance. Okay, and so Ross doesn't actually like the term prima facie. In fact, there's a couple of paragraphs in the reading where he sort of complains about it. He says, "Well, look, I realize that I'm using this term kind of imprecisely. What I really want is a term that means this other thing, but I'm using prima facie anyway." Okay, and he just didn't think of a more appropriate term, so he just went ahead and used prima facie in a way that it isn't usually used. Okay, well, it turns out that there is a more appropriate term that does exist. He just apparently was not aware of it. Um, the more appropriate term in this case is the term pro tanto. Okay, and so a prima facie duty would be, if we used the term prima facie for what it really means, a prima facie duty would be one that looked at first like it was a duty, but turned out to not be a duty after all. Okay, it looked like it was, but it wasn't. Okay, that's a prima facie duty. A pro tanto duty is something that really is a duty, but that might conflict with or be superseded by some other duties. Okay, and that's really what Ross meant. That's what he wanted. That's what he says he wanted. And so he uses prima facie to really mean something like pro tanto. So whenever you write about this, I encourage you to use the term pro tanto. But again, you need to be aware that though Ross uses the term prima facie, he sort of uses it to mean what pro tanto means. Okay, so that is that duties, right? They really are your duties. Okay, they weren't something that looked like a duty but turned out not to be. They really were your duty. It's just that they could be they could conflict with and be overridden by some other duty. That's what a pro tanto duty is. And that's what he's talking about. And so Ross maintains that there are a whole variety of these duties, and he provides a kind of short list. And he doesn't intend that this should cover every possible duty somebody has, but just give you a general sketch of the sort of thing that he means. However, I think that his list is really pretty good. I think that there's rather little that can be productively added to it. I think it's a very good list, even if it doesn't pretend to get everything. And so we break those duties up into two categories. That is, duties we owe to others and duties we owe to ourselves. And first, the duties we owe to ourselves are something like the duties of prudence, right? We wanted to give them a name, that's what they'd be called, the duties of prudence. And so these duties are things like self-improvement, as physically, mentally, morally. These are things that you owe to yourself. They're duty that you owe to yourself. And so you would be morally inferior, right? If you neglected those things, if you didn't improve yourself to at least some extent, those are the duties of prudence. Notice these aren't the duties to do what you want; they are the duties to do what is best for you. Okay, that's a very different thing there. So it seems like we do have some duties to ourselves. We have some duties to take care of ourselves. We, of course, have other duties as well. We also have duties toward others. And this is where he breaks it down a little bit more finely, because most of morality concerns what we owe to others. And so some of our duties are based on or they're derived from past actions of ours. So, for example, the duties of fidelity are keeping promises that we've made. So the idea is that if you make a promise to somebody and and you feel like it's your duty to keep that promise, I think Ross wants to say, okay, why do you feel like it's your duty to keep that promise? And if the first thing to come to mind is, well, because I promised, right? And that's actually for Ross, that's the right answer. The reason to keep a promise is because you made a promise. That's what a promise is. And so what creates the duty is the fact that you made the promise. Okay, and so that's based on something in the past. It's not based on the consequences of keeping or breaking the promise. It's based on the fact that you made it. That's all. There's a duty of, say, reparation, right? So that is when you do harm to somebody or when you wrong them or something like that. The idea is that in general you have some duty to make good on that kind of a wrong. All right. So for example, let's say you're not paying attention and you roll your suitcase over somebody's foot in the airport. Right? I think the way we often put it in this case is you owe them an apology, right? At the very least, right? I mean, if you actually like, say, break their foot or something like that on accident, through being careless, it seems like you probably owe them some compensation as well, like maybe they, cover their doctor bill or something like that. That's a kind of duty of reparation. And again, you owe the duty not because of the consequences of making the reparation, but because you caused the wrong. You did the wrong, therefore you have this duty to make good on it. Same thing with gratitude. Okay, look, if somebody gives you a cookie, you might just say, "Hey, thank you." Right? That could be something you owe to them, some sort of gratitude. Sometimes it might be more complicated, such as paying it forward, passing on a good deed. Okay? And of course, there are some other duties that we owe to others that aren't necessarily based on past actions, but are instead based on certain kinds of circumstances. Right? So, for example, there's the duty of beneficence, that is the duty of doing good, that is helping others in need when we can. That does seem to be something that is morally required of us, though it doesn't go forever, right? But we generally are required to help others when we can. There's also the duty of non-maleficence, that is the duty to do no harm. And of course, there are various duties of justice, that is being fair to people, that is giving people what they deserve and not withholding what they deserve. Okay, not giving them something they don't deserve, and etc. So those are all these duties of that are not based on past actions. And again, when you take those 7 things: prudence, fidelity, reparation, gratitude, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, honestly, I think this is a fairly comprehensive list of the kinds of things that we find to be valuable in a moral life. The trouble is that they can sometimes conflict with one another. And so when these duties conflict, we have to determine which duty is more important. Okay. In fact, that's another famous phrase in the article by W.D. Ross, is that he says that when it comes time, right, to decide which of your duties is the most pressing one, you've got all these prima facie duties, right, that these things that really are your duty, but then the one that's most important becomes your duty sans phrase. It's not a prima facie duty anymore if it's the really most important duty in that circumstance. It's your duty. That's the thing you then have to do. And when you're faced with that, you just have to be as careful as you can. And so he wants to say, look, there's no fixed hierarchy of duties. There's no duties that always override other ones. So give you a couple examples. You might say our duty of benevolence in saving some child from drowning would outweigh our duty to meet a friend for lunch if we happen to see some child drowning on the way to lunch. Okay, the idea is if you stop to help the child, if you stop to save them from drowning, dealing with that whole situation is going to take long enough that you're going to miss the lunch that you promised that you would go to. But in this case, it seems like it seems fairly clear that breaking the promise is necessary to fulfill your duty of benevolence, right? That the duty of benevolence is going to be more important in that case. However, imagine that you've promised to buy your child ballerina slippers for some dance class, okay? Uh, and you've got just exactly enough money to do that. It would seem like to then give that money to some broke traveler might be nice of you. It's a beneficent act. It does help people out, but it seems like in that case maybe it's clear that it's better to keep the promise at the expense of doing a beneficent act as opposed to. So it looks like it doesn't look like there's a single duty or a kind of duty which will always override some of the other ones. It seems like you could always come up with cases where it seems like the much more pressing duty is one of them, and then you can come up with another case where it seems like the very much more pressing duty is the other one instead. Okay. Also, if there was a hierarchy of duties, then there would be some method for ranking the duties. And if you have one single method for ranking all your duties, well, now you're a moral monist. Okay, so we can't really do that with Ross's theory. Now, Ross does mention that there are some tendencies, that some of these duties tend to be more stringent than others. For example, the duty to do no harm tends to be more stringent than many others. We seldom owe anything to ourselves or anybody that requires harming another person. But of course, sometimes the duty to do no harm is not the most important one. And so let's talk a little bit about how this affects a kind of pluralist theory and what pluralist theories have to be like. Okay. So instead of only having one reason to act, that it's like for the utilitarian, it would be maximizing pleasure, for the Kantian acting in accord with the categorical imperative. For the pluralist, we have lots of reasons to act, some of which are more important in some contexts than in others. And so this is really important to realize. What Ross says to do in those kinds of cases is just to say, look, what you're supposed to do is think really carefully and come to the considered judgment, it is never more than that, to do whatever seems to be the best idea at the time, right? Now, that doesn't sound like very concrete moral advice, and the reason it doesn't sound like very concrete moral advice is because it isn't, right? And so Ross's system pays for its plausibility. I mean, it seems to really match up, I think, with what a lot of us think about morality. It gives us the right answer in a lot of these kinds of cases and explains why we have trouble with some kinds of cases. But it pays for that plausibility with its complexity. There's lots going on, a lot of moving parts, and with its uncertainty, right? We don't get to ever just apply some single straightforward rule of thumb. We don't get to ever apply a simple procedure the way that Kant or the way that the utilitarian would have in order to decide what's moral or what isn't. It's just uncertain by its very nature. That's the way the theory is, and it's a problem that the theory has. And so again, this is the famous quote here that summarizes the difficulty in applying moral pluralism as an action guiding principle. He puts it this way, he says, when I'm in a situation, as perhaps I always am, in which more than one of these prima facie duties is incumbent on me, what I have to do is study the situation as fully as I can until I form the considered opinion it is never more that in the circumstances one of them is more incumbent than any other. Then I am bound to think that to do this prima facie duty is my duty sans phrase, that is plain old duty, your prima facie one in this situation. And so this vagueness, right, in terms of the method is disturbing, but it's probably unavoidable in a pluralist theory because, again, there is no single overriding principle. If we could come up with some ranking of duties that always applied, then whatever method we use to do our ranking would be a single morally overriding principle, and then we would be ethical monists. Okay, and so it seems like just like a utilitarian can't get away from the idea that consequences are all that matter, even though sometimes that idea looks bad. That's just part of the theory. And so the pluralist likewise can't get out of the idea that it's a little wishy-washy. They really can't kind of get out of it. So despite that, there are some decent arguments for assuming that for saying that moral pluralism is really a good view, or perhaps even the right view. And one of these arguments is what's known as the agonizing decisions argument. This is an argument that's advocated by a fellow by the name of Michael Gill in another assigned reading. And so here's the thing about it. Sometimes, even when we think we have done the right thing, we experience a kind of moral agony. Okay, this is what he refers to as the agonizing decision. And this indicates that there really are just plural moral concerns. Gill is going to say that we can't make sense of moral agony without there being more than one thing that is genuinely morally important. Okay? And he presents the argument excellently, and he uses a very well-chosen example. I'm not going to clamp all over it by sort of telling you what the example is. You can read it perfectly clearly yourself. And but what I would say is pay very close attention to what makes something an agonizing decision. Okay, because not all decisions are agonizing. There's a very specific set of circumstances that have to apply to make it agonizing. Certainly pay a lot of attention to that. And then his argument is this: that if there really are agonizing decisions, then the best explanation for there being agonizing decisions is that moral pluralism is just true. Okay, he's going to say that it's harder to explain any of that moral agony from any of the monist points of view, and I think his point is a good one. The other thing I want you to pay a lot of attention to in the Gill article is this idea of a moral design problem. Okay? And so Gill thinks of moral decision making as being really similar to design problems that are faced in other kinds of fields or endeavors. So he gives this example. Imagine you're an architect asked to design a building. The client who wants you to build a building for them, they have this meeting and they tell you, here's what I want. Right, I want a building that is a green, right, in the sense of being resource efficient or sustainable, not necessarily like the color green, right? They want a green building. They also want a really beautiful building. They want it to be, very pleasant to look at, very pretty, striking visually, all that sort of stuff. And they also want it to be cost effective, right, which is another word for cheap, right? They want it to be as cheap as possible, commensurate with these other goals, because they're not made of money. They have a budget. So it seems like now, again, imagine yourself actually in the seat of this architect, right? You really have to design the building. Think of the right way to approach this kind of a problem, and think about some obviously wrong ways of approaching this problem. Obviously, the most wrong way of approaching the problem is to build a building that is not green, not beautiful, and not cost effective, right? A really expensive, really energy wasting, really ugly building, right? You could do that. And that would be the very worst thing you could do. But think instead of some other more plausible sort of wrong answers. And it seems like another obviously wrong answer would be to maximize just one of those three valuable things while ignoring the others. That is, maybe make the greenest possible building, but it'll be very ugly and very expensive, right? Or make a building that's really, really pretty, but it's really, really power hungry and very inefficient and also very expensive, right? Or make a building that's just really cheap, but it's not very efficient and it's also not very pretty, right? I mean, so it seems like any of those kinds of approaches obviously not. And so Gill is going to argue that the reason that moral reasoning often feels like this kind of a balancing act, where the idea is what we're trying to do is we're trying to get as much as we can of each of those things without giving up too much on any of those things. Notice that's the kind of headspace you'd probably get into as that architect. You'd have to say, okay, look, I can make it a little bit more efficient at the cost of making it a lot more expensive, so I probably can't do that. But if I can make it a lot more beautiful for just a little more cost, well, I probably should do that, right, et cetera. So the idea is that there's always these trade-offs, and if you get a whole lot out of the trade, then you probably ought to do it. But if you don't really further anything by, or if the cost is too high for getting some extra bit of some value, then maybe you shouldn't, right? So the idea is you're gonna try and get as much of all of them as you can. And sometimes moral decision making really does feel like that. And Gill thinks that the reason that moral decision making feels like that is because it is like that, right? That he's going to say the reason that we have these sorts of ideas about morality is because that's the way morality just really is. And so, again, to summarize the overall unit here, I want to pay attention to a few sort of large scale ideas. So first off, all monist views are absolutist views, right? And again, that's not necessarily bad, but it's a thing that people do criticize those views over. That absolutist views have all kinds of problems with some kinds of difficult cases, like the sheriff case that J.J.C. Smart brings up, like the case of the murderer at the door that Kant brings up, the cases of in the trolley problem that Thompson brings up, right? And so we have our theories that really do genuinely have trouble with some of those cases. Pluralism is an alternative kind of set of moral theories, and it handles some of those difficult cases really well, right? The reason that what it can say in the trolley case is that well, look, what you want to do is you want to sort of get as much of everything as you can without necessarily So in the trolley case, they're just going to say when you consider the situation carefully, it seems like the consequences are the most important feature of that case. But when you look at the doctor case, they're going to say, look, it's a different sort of a case, right? You're involving sort of the medical profession, whatever. They'll see that there's some reason to think that perhaps preserving rights is the most important thing in that case, and so it can handle some of these difficult cases really, really well. However, it's inherently hard to apply and systematize. That is, it's hard to tell why, to make certain decisions in certain kinds of difficult cases, or really what to do. It's hard to apply it as an active guiding principle. Right? This really is just a problem that it has. It pays for its plausibility and handling these difficult cases well, by, in some sense, handling some easy cases rather poorly. Um, so it is one more theory. It's not the theory that solves all of our problems, but rather it solves some of our problems while introducing different ones. And so that's moral pluralism, and it's the last of the major ethical views that we'll be taking a look at here in this course.